"It is a pushing age," he wrote, "and we must shove with the best."
That wasn't the statesman of 1940. That was Winston Churchill in his 20s, restless, bereaved, ambitious, and determined not to be left behind.
He had watched his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, blaze across British politics and then fade. It was said his father had died by inches in public. The lesson was stark. Reputation was everything. Fame was the spur.
But soldiering alone wouldn't do. He needed danger. He needed print. He needed headlines. From the start, he fused warfare and publicity into a single project.
He didn't just want to make it to the northwest frontier of India. He was determined to stride onto the British national stage.
Or die trying. Find out more in this new series of Churchill, The Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to this new series of Churchill, The Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toy, and with me is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Warren Doctor.
Hi, Richard.
How are you doing?
I'm excited to do this as this is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, it is exciting, and it was a key part of a feature film which came out in the early 1970s, Young Winston, directed by Richard Attenborough.
Little known fact about me, I pitched making this a series to the Churchill family and their agents, and they were interested. And if Ridley Scott's listening, I'm ready to do a historical drama. So contact me, slide into my DMs, Ridley Scott. I like to imagine famous people listen to our podcast.
So I guess what's interesting about it, though, is that Churchill really did set out to have an adventure, but also have an adventure that was going to cause a lot of publicity. So how did Churchill end up on the northwest frontier of India? It wasn't easy for him to get there, actually. Let's probably go back to the beginning to think about the circumstances of his youth and how he came to join the army.
Well, Richard, as you know, and our listeners will know, he was born into an immensely powerful and relatively wealthy family, the Churchill family. And really at the kind of tip top, his uncle was a duke, which is kind of as good as it gets, really, apart from being Prince of Wales. And Churchill himself, of course, he went to Harrow. He was trained as a military officer in those days. And of course, he was also growing up in the shadow of his father, Lord Randolph, who had a very meteoric rise in Tory politics, particularly under the Salisbury government, but then also had a very difficult fall to earth as well.
Yeah, I mean, he was also a sort of relatively young man when he came to public prominence. Randolph, not quite as young as Winston was, but he was somebody who went into politics slightly, I think, because it was rather expected that members of such a prestigious family would kind of become the local MP. So I think it wasn't something which had necessarily seized his heart from the beginning. But once he got to be an MP, very easily kind of slotted into the Houses of Parliament on, of course, a much narrower franchise, and the fact that his family had lots of local influence. He really
I think
gets
it's worth
into it.
mentioning as well that Lord Randolph was known for being a brilliant speech maker and could do things impromptu. Whereas
Absolutely.
Winston and his speeches, he would write out notes, which is probably perhaps its own episode, but his father, it could just come to him and he could just do the stuff off the top of his head.
Yes, and I mean, of course, we don't have any recordings of Lord Randolph, but a lot of people commented at the time when Winston was a young MP that the style was similar, and there was a lot of conscious imitation, I think, that went on, not just in terms of the delivery, but in terms of the broad ideas. Now, but I think what we should say is that the relationship between Lord Randolph and Winston was not really very good. And to the point, as you say, the family was wealthy, but again, like Winston, Randolph got rid of his money as fast as he got hold of it, or sometimes even faster than he really had it. And as did Churchill's mother, and so, Jenny, Lady Randolph. And so you kind of got this couple who have married, had a passionate love affair and got married very quickly. Some people say it's a bit contested whether or not she was already pregnant with Winston at the point they got married, but neither of them, I think, is kind of monogamous type. They also are pretty neglectful of Winston. There's this line in Churchill's book, My Early Life, where he says of his mother, she shone for me like the evening star, but at a distance.
Right, and there's no way to read the letters of Churchill's early life back home to his mother and father and not just feel very bad for him, because he's so desperate to just get their attention, and you can kind of hear his desperation. It's heartbreaking, actually. And of course, his relationship with his father was particularly difficult, and this is all compounded by the fact that as Churchill starts coming of age and going to Harrow and then preparing to go on his first adventure, his father was failing. His health started to fail significantly, probably from syphilis.
Yes, and also just to explain how Churchill got into the army before we kind of get into these trouble spots around the world. There is this conversation between Lord Randolph where, remember, Winston kind of loved playing with toy soldiers and sort of lining them up and having epic battles, and was very
Yeah, he
conscious
would
of.
pretend he was John Marlborough
Well, exactly. So
fighting
he was
Napoleon or
conscious
whatever.
of his ancestry and sort of the first Duke of Marlborough and so on. And Lord Randolph comes and has a chat and sort of says, "Well, I've been having a think about your future, and I've been wondering if you'd like to go into the army." And Winston Churchill is a bit like, "Oh, my father's finally taking some notice on me," and says, "Oh yes, I think that would be a good idea," because that seems to be the answer that is required. And later finds out that his father just didn't think that he was bright enough to go into the law. And so that the army was a second option. And of course, he graduates, sort of leaves Harrow School. We should mention for any listeners who don't know, that is a kind of elite, it's called a public school in Britain. It's one of these weird Anglo-American differences. A public school is really a private school, of course.
Nothing's easy.
He gets into Sandhurst, which is a training academy for military officers, having taken a long time to get the required entry grades. His father's been very sort of angry with him when he's kind of perceived as sort of having messed up on his work or on his exams. So Churchill, just at the point where Lord Randolph dies, as you mentioned, although David, of course, knows for certain what he died of. Syphilis is certainly a possibility, and I think Winston Churchill himself believed that. This is the point where Churchill is just about turning 21 and as graduating from Sandhurst. And I do think there's a point, you made a few minutes earlier about Churchill wanting the attention of his parents. Of course, his father has now died, but there's really a kind of a strong attention-seeking element to Churchill's behavior. I mean, that's not just like a psychological value judgment. He wants attention from the press because he sees this as the route to a potential political career. He really is attention-seeking, but of course it makes you ask the question about whether this was a kind of a displacement for a psychological need for validation for his parents to recognize that he'd achieved something.
There's no way to read his youth or about his youth, at least from my point of view, and think that he is not undergoing some mild psychosis here where he is displacing the attention of people to replace the attention of his parents, particularly his father. Now that his father's passed, as you say, that becomes an impossible void to fill, really. And so you can see, I mean, even in the letters he writes to his mother, he says, I'm ready to sink my name even in the cannon's mouth. He's going to make his name. And he understands that to do this, he's in the military, but he also needs to be able to write. He needs to be able to create the headlines. And so this leads him on to getting his first kind of official dispatchment in Cuba.
Right, but this is something where he really had to go to great lengths in order to pull this one off, right? I mean, this was not every soldier who's just graduated from Sandhurst kind of goes off to Cuba or somewhere like that. This is pretty unusual.
No, he has to work the kind of back channels mostly through his mother and her social contacts in order to get to the right people, in order to guarantee the right positions. One of them's the head of British military intelligence in London. And Churchill says he really wants to go on this, and he agrees to let Churchill go if Churchill will undertake finding out some military information about what kind of Mausers the Cuban insurrectionists were using and that the Spanish were using. So Churchill not only goes there as a correspondent, but he's also effectively a spy.
So this is kind of like what he does in his holidays, right? I mean, this
Yeah,
is
yeah, he's doing this for fun.
um, and he writes letters as well. I mean, this is kind of the way in which journalism worked to a certain extent back in the day, which was you could set yourself up. You could say, well, I'm in this case going to Cuba, and I'm going to write to the editor of the Daily Graphic and say, well, do you want me to send some letters back, and will you pay me for them in order to fill space in the paper? In effect, actually, it's not journalism which says breaking news, this thing has just happened, because by the time the letter gets there, it'll be 3 weeks old news. It won't be breaking news any longer. And so that kind of is the style of reportage which he develops, which is going to be so important in India, which is a kind of, it's not just this happened, this happened, this happened. It is reflection. He is trying to be, some would say, a little bit pretentious, but with philosophical thoughts that are in there about, the nature of warfare, the nature of history, everything that's led up to this. Some irony mixed in there. And so he earns 5 guineas per letter for 5 articles in the Daily Graphic. And that's kind of a pretty sizable sum. I mean, that's
It's nothing to sneeze at.
nothing to sneeze at. It's kind of like for some manual labourer, that would kind of be a bit more than a week's wages.
Right. And I mean, if you've ever, and I know you have, read Churchill's dispatches from Cuba, one of the things that he focuses in on is the fact that the Spanish don't seem to be able to win the hearts and minds of the Cubans, and that the Cubans basically just revolt and then leave and revolt and then leave. And Churchill wonders if it would ever be possible to fully control Cuba in this way. But one of my favorite things is in his last dispatch, he wonders, well, if Cuba had remained with the British Empire in the early 1700s rather than it being ceded to the Spanish, maybe it would have been run better. And so even amongst this philosophical thinking, if it had been run by the British, it would have been fine. I mean, that's basically what he's saying.
So, I mean, I guess kind of like the point of flagging Cuba is that it has set the scene for what is going to happen when he ships out to India, which he does with his regiment, the 4th Hussars, in September 1896. But the fact is that when he gets to India, military life is incredibly boring.
And he does spend the first maybe 6 months, maybe more, just reading. I mean, he sends for his books, he establishes his library because he decides that he should make himself very educated. So he starts reading Gibbon and really spends some time reading until eventually he settles on the idea that he could once again go on an adventure.
Yeah, and so he's already kind of set himself up for this in a way, because there's a sort of key general called General Sabindan Blood. Pretty cool name.
Obviously he's a badass. I'm just
I mean, I've never heard of the name Bindon before. I don't know if his parents just made it up. So he sends off a telegram to Bindon Blood, and off he goes.
And he's able to use his mother's influence with Bendon and other leaders so that he can ultimately land this position. But the issue was, of course, Bendon was open to it, but they didn't really have a position on his general staff. But the position that he did have open, that he was willing to give to young Winston, was press correspondent. And he,
Yeah,
of course, had the experience from Cuba.
yeah, and that's a really important point, because he's serving in the military and at the same time being a journalist, which is not unusual at the time. And so, but where Lady Randolph's influence really comes in is getting Churchill a commission with the Daily Telegraph, and she gets this reply from the proprietor who says, tell Winston to post picturesque, forcible letters.
Which is really remarkable because Churchill's working his angles through the military how he can, but then also his mother's working for his station while she's back in London, landing him this position as a journalist. Churchill's able to do both of these things.
Yeah, so it's a bit like being an embedded correspondent, but you might be expected to pick up a rifle and shoot somebody in between doing your journalism, and eventually does kind of sort of make the transition to sort of doing the fighting as well as the writing. And so what he's done by this point is he's kind of pulled strings to get himself sent into a combat situation, initially as a journalist, but he has also leveraged his social connections in order to be able to turn that experience into publicity at home. And the only question remains, is there going to still be fighting going on by the time that he gets there? And let's tackle that question after the break.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, and with me is my own Sir Bendon Blood, Professor Richard Toy.
And so what has happened is that Churchill has got himself attached to Malacan Field Force. Remember, what has happened is an uprising on the northwest frontier of India. Now, these kinds of events, these kinds of rebellions were not uncommon.
No. So it has to first be understood that all this is happening inside of the great game between the Russian Empire and the British Empire for control of the Hindu Kush and for this area. The Russian Empire had for years at least made the British anxious that they might try to come over the top of the Himalayas and down into India. And so Britain had pushed back, forming various alliances with various tribes, including the leader of Afghanistan. And so it stood there as a nation trapped between Great Britain and the Russian Empire. And so you have these two empires vying for control.
Well, indeed, it's worth pointing out the previous failed Afghan wars, which had been humiliating for Britain, most recently in the early 1880s. And so remember that British control over India had extended piecemeal really over a couple of centuries or so, and so that rather than having a methodology where the British kind of formally take over an area and put down kind of fence posts and say, this is a frontier. They try to get the local tribes to give their allegiance to the British, to say that they're going to behave themselves, that they're maybe going to pay some taxes, etc., etc. And this was kind of quite controversial in British politics because, of course, periodically it did involve the tribespeople when they saw an opportunity rising up against the British and trying to throw that partial control off. And this, of course, led to expensive military expeditions of the kind of which Churchill was now involved with, the Malacan Field Force. Now, in this particular case, there was a Islamic dimension or religious dimension to this, in that there was a prophet who was preaching rebellion and so forth. And so in some respects, this was perceived as an ideological threat as well, which might stir up Muslims in the rest of India.
That's right. And this particular issue about whether or not you pursue a frontier forward policy or not was also something that bedeviled Lord Randolph while he was Secretary for the State of India.
Yeah, and I think the political controversy in Britain is kind of how far you push this line. Do you just let the tribesmen get on with it? Or is it essential to progressively push forward, not necessarily all in one go, accepting occasional retreats and so on? Nobody says we want to do away with the empire, but there's really a dividing line between those who are pushing to expand it, the supporters of this so-called frontier policy, and the ones who are saying, look, we stick to what we have, we try and govern that well, we don't expand further.
And so this is the kind of stage that Churchill enters. So he does make the enormous trip across India up to the northwest frontier.
Yeah. And he goes to the Bangalore railway station and tries to buy a ticket. And he says in his memoirs that the Indian clerk, having collected from me a small sack of rupees, pushed an ordinary ticket through the pigeonhole. And then Churchill says, well, how far is this? And the polite Indian consulted a railway timetable and impassively answered 2,028 miles. So, this is it's no picnic. And that makes it a sort of a 5-day journey in total.
And in Churchill's first letter from the Malacan, which he wrote for the Daily Telegraph on the 3rd of September, 1897, He describes how he came to the theater of war and that he was going to, for his readers, observe every sign along the line of communication which indicates an unusual state of affairs. And so the first real clear indication of mobilization came as he left Bangalore and he saw the 6th Madras Infantry departing for the front. And he said it was a striking and in some ways a moving spectacle. Particularly these early dispatches, I always find them as almost like he's just a Victorian travel writer. I mean, it is this very Victorian view of the world, and he often writes about India like it's another planet, particularly in the landscapes. So I think that it's really interesting when you can see these kinds of, I'm going to say, colonial trappings in his language.
You know, I mean, very fascinating travel writing, I should say, superior Victorian travel writing. But he kind of talks about in the letter that you mentioned, he kind of talks about camels being crowded into open trucks and how they present a strange and ridiculous aspect. And he's kind of looking at every scene, thinking, how can I turn this into words which I can sell to the Daily Telegraph for 5 quid a letter. Every word is very carefully crafted with a view to the impact that it could be making back in London.
And then, of course, when he actually formally gets to the Malacan Field Force at Norashara, I think the actual reality of the campaign and the warfare sits in on him. One of the first things he sees is a large field hospital, and he said the unpleasant and somber side of the campaign could be seen. Fever, dysentery, and bullets, he noted, had accumulated more than 300 poor fellows, and the daily death marks the progress of which tacticians and strategists have called the waste of war.
This is really interesting because he's still getting paid. He's still getting his army salary, right? And he's being a journalist. So the reason that the Sabindan blood is willing to take him on as a journalist is because I would imagine he is thinking, well, this is going to be good news for my career, right? What's the point of leading a punitive expedition if nobody finds out about it? He could probably rely on Churchill to say what a great general he is.
Of course he does.
Yeah, of course he does. But what this does do is put Churchill in the position where he is working for the army, but also needs to make his letters interesting. And so, in a way, what is surprising, although Churchill, as we'll see, is somebody who's going to hold a lot back, there are these points, like how many kind of journalists or, let's say, army press spokespeople today would send messages back saying, well, there's kind of a lot of fever and dysentery going on. It's all very somber, and let's talk about the waste of war. That's not very on message, right? But he kind of gets away with this. He doesn't get into trouble for those reflections. But I think he is kind of pushing the envelope there.
No, I completely agree. And so he walks this very fine line, but it gets easier, I think, when they actually engage with the enemy. But he also makes, I think, really important observations, right? So one of the things he talked about is the importance of a heliograph. Do you know what a heliograph is, Richard?
I do know what a heliograph is, but I will allow you to explain it to me because the listeners may not know.
So, as you can imagine, the landscape of the Northwest frontier is very difficult, very deep valleys and gulches and tall mountaintops. So, you would have someone almost at the top of one of these mountaintops with a bright reflective surface shining the sun into a Morse code thing, which would basically be a signal. And this was called a heliograph, and they would send these signals out as a means to communicate across vast distances. But what I found really interesting is that he says that the heliograph flickered all day long with messages to Norashara, to India, and onto the tape machines at the London clubs, which I thought was a really brilliant line that links all of these different places together. And of course, he praises Bend Blood's flanking maneuvers and said he was able to clear the valley at one stroke, and he described one scene in which soldiers and followers in every conceivable costume produced a picture full of interest and animation.
But I mean, I suppose just picking up on your point, that what that connection between the heliograph and the telegraph reveals is that it was possible to communicate vast distances very, very quickly. Now, you need to have the cable connecting the different parts of the world. You can't just send it to your message to any other part of the world. It has to be somewhere in the network. But nevertheless, there is that possibility.
You're absolutely right. You have to be a part of the network. And in fact, in several of Churchill's dispatches, restoring or rebuilding telegraph lines or talking about the enemy having destroyed them is a huge part of the correspondence, right? It's like we're trying to build a communication infrastructure, which honestly reminds me of when the UK and the USA were in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. Maintaining comms in that part of the world is really difficult. And that's one of the things that Churchill devotes his writing to, and rightfully so.
Absolutely. Now, just in terms of talking about communications networks, we should mention that Churchill, the Finest Half, has a Blue Sky account and also a LinkedIn group that people can join. So I just kind of chuck that casually in.
Well, it's
So
a part of our communications network, so it fits. Well
exactly.
done.
So that Churchill is in this much more, how should we say, it is globalized, but it's not instant communication. It's not instant gratification all the time. And that's why he spends a fair amount of his time being bored, a fair amount of his time reading, which is certainly beneficial for him. And so he's kind of hoping and waiting for something to happen. He's actually having to write a letter to the Daily Telegraph saying, well, nothing's really happened yet, but I'm pretty hopeful that something might happen soon and I'll be able to tell you about it.
Right, and so at one point, he talks about the rumors, and I'm gonna read a paragraph here. Meanwhile, rumors run through the camp of movements here and marches there, all ultimately pointing to a move against the Motmans. It should be remembered that the powerful tribe deliberately made an unprovoked attack on a British post, and without cause or warning committed a violation of imperial territory.
I think that's so important actually, because what we're getting here is he's not just describing, he's justifying what the British are doing. He's saying these people who were about to attack basically got it coming to them because they violated imperial territory. And so he goes on saying, I rejoice to be able to end this letter with the news that such audacity is no longer to remain unchastised, and that movements are now contemplated which indicate the adoption of a policy agreeable to expert opinion. And this is, I think, where he's advocating between the lines this kind of so-called forward policy of pushing forward and expanding the empire. He then goes on to say, of the progress of these movements, I hope to give some account in my subsequent letters, and if possible to draw for the everyday reader at his breakfast table in comfortable England something of a picture of the vivid open-air scenes which are presented by the war in the Indian highlands.
I really love that last bit. I mean, well, two things really. The first is he is absolutely justifying why they're there. But the second thing is that he's drawing the difference between the people reading him back in comfortable England, and that gives him a little bit of scope to play with what he's got to do in the scenes that he paints, however vivid or brutal perhaps they might be in his thing, saying, hey, I'm just trying to give it to you the way I saw it, and you're at home in your comfortable chair, and I'm telling you what's happening on the streets here in Kabul, not literally Kabul, but I mean it. In that way, it's able to distance the readers from from the action in a way, but also saying, hey, this action is necessary.
The young subaltern had shoved his way to the frontier. The empire provided the stage, and he strode into the limelight.
A young man in a hurry, learning that war could be reported, shaped, and turned into political capital.
Next time, we'll follow him further into the fighting itself.
And watch how the performance under fire forged the public Churchill. That's next time here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.